never forget the day I watched a 70-year-old war hero get tasered at his wife's grave, and how 7 Marines in dress blues changed everything that followed. My name's Tommy Rodriguez, and I've been a Marine for 8 years now. I thought I'd seen some messed up stuff overseas, but nothing prepared me for what went down at Oakwood Cemetery that cold October morning. See, I knew Roland Kemper from the VFW hall where us younger vets would sometimes grab a beer and listen to the old-timers tell their stories. Roland wasn't much of a talker usually, but when he did speak, you damn well listened. The man had that quiet authority that only comes from real combat experience and decades of living with the weight of it. I was nursing my second cup of coffee that Tuesday morning when my phone started buzzing like crazy. Mrs. Chen from the corner market was practically screaming into the phone about some cops arresting an old man at the cemetery. "Tommy, you need to get down here right now! They got that nice man who buys flowers for his wife every day. They're treating him like a criminal." My blood went cold because I knew exactly who she was talking about. Roland had buried Margaret just the day before, and I'd been meaning to swing by and pay my respects. What I found when I got to Oakwood Cemetery was something that'll haunt me until the day I die. There was Roland Kemper, this man who'd earned a Bronze Star for carrying 3 wounded soldiers to safety under enemy fire, sitting on the ground in handcuffs while some baby-faced cop stood over him like he'd just apprehended public enemy number 1. Roland's navy blue suit, the same one I'd seen him wear to every important occasion at the VFW, was dusty and torn from where they'd wrestled him to the ground. His American flag lapel pin was hanging by a thread, but it was his eyes that got me. This was a man who'd stared down enemy fighters in 2 different conflicts, who'd helped build half the buildings in our town with his own hands, who'd spent 3 years watching cancer slowly steal away the love of his life. And now he looked broken. Not just sad, broken. Like something fundamental inside him had snapped. Officer Danny Morrison, I found out his name later during the investigation, was maybe 25 years old and had that cocky swagger that screams, "I peaked in high school." He was strutting around Roland like he'd just solved the crime of the century, talking into his radio about subduing an uncooperative vagrant. A vagrant. This decorated veteran who'd paid more taxes in 1 year than Morrison had probably earned in his entire short career. I could see other people starting to gather at the cemetery gates. Word travels fast in a small town, especially when it involves someone like Roland who'd lived here his whole life. Mrs. Patterson from the pharmacy was there, shaking her head and dabbing at her eyes with a tissue. Bill Henderson, who'd worked construction with Roland for 20 years, was pacing back and forth like a caged animal, his hands clenched into fists. These weren't random gawkers. These were people who knew Roland's character, who understood what they were witnessing was fundamentally wrong. Morrison was explaining to his backup officers how he'd found this transient loitering in the cemetery after closing hours. He described Roland's slow movements as aggressive behavior and claimed the old man had assumed a threatening posture when ordered to leave. I wanted to laugh if the situation wasn't so tragic. Roland Kemper assuming a threatening posture was about as likely as my grandmother joining the UFC. The man's arthritis was so bad he could barely tie his own shoes some days. "Sir, I need you to understand that this is private property," Morrison was saying to Roland in that condescending tone cops use when they think they're talking to someone beneath them. "Visiting hours ended at sunset yesterday. You've been here for over 12 hours without permission." Roland tried to explain, his voice hoarse from grief and exhaustion. "Officer, I buried my wife yesterday morning, Margaret Ann Kemper. We were married 43 years. I just needed some time to say goodbye properly." His voice cracked on the word goodbye, and I saw Morrison roll his eyes like he was dealing with a drunk making excuses. "Sir, I understand you're upset, but the rules apply to everyone. The cemetery has posted hours for a reason. If everyone just decided to stay whenever they wanted, we'd have chaos." Morrison was reading from some manual in his head, following procedures without an ounce of human decency or common sense. That's when Roland made his mistake. He asked for 5 more minutes. "Please, officer, just 5 more minutes to finish my prayers. Then I'll leave peacefully." To Roland, this was a reasonable request from one man to another. To Morrison, it was defiance of his authority, and guys like Morrison can't handle that. "Sir, I've given you multiple opportunities to comply voluntarily. You're now under arrest for criminal trespassing on public property." The handcuffs came out, and I watched this decorated veteran extend his wrists automatically, a lifetime of following orders kicking in even in his moment of deepest grief. But here's where it gets really ugly. Roland's legs gave out as they were walking him to the patrol car. The man was 70 years old, had been standing at his wife's grave for hours without food or water, and was dealing with grief that would have flattened men half his age. He stumbled and went down on one knee, catching himself on a headstone to keep from falling completely. Morrison immediately called for his taser. "Subject is resisting arrest. Subject is down but attempting to flee." I've seen enough combat to know the difference between someone who's collapsing from exhaustion and someone who's trying to escape. Roland wasn't going anywhere. He was barely conscious at that point. The electric current hit him right in the back, and Roland Kemper, Bronze Star recipient, devoted husband, and pillar of our community, dropped face first into the grass beside his wife's grave. The sound he made wasn't quite a scream. It was something deeper, more primitive. It was the sound of a man's dignity being stripped away in the place where his heart was already buried. That's when I made the call that changed everything. I hit speed dial for Sergeant Jake Williams, then Corporal Mike Santos, then the rest of my unit who lived within driving distance. The message was simple. "We got a situation at Oakwood Cemetery. Brother in trouble. Come in dressed blues if you got him." In the Marines, when someone says a brother's in trouble, you don't ask questions, you just show up. While we waited for backup, I watched Morrison and his buddies congratulating themselves on a job well done. They'd successfully subdued a grieving widower with a heart condition and arthritis. Real heroes, these guys. Roland was sitting in the back of the patrol car now, his head in his hands, and I could see his shoulders shaking. 70 years old and crying in the back of a police car, for the crime of loving his wife too much to leave her alone. The cavalry arrived exactly 18 minutes later. I know because I was watching the clock on my phone, timing how long it was taking for justice to show up. 6 Marines in dress blues walking through that cemetery gate in perfect formation like we were marching in a parade. Shoes polished to a mirror shine, uniforms pressed so sharp you could cut yourself on the creases, and that unmistakable bearing that says United States Marine Corps from a mile away. Morrison looked up from his paperwork, and I watched the color drain from his face. He'd probably never seen Marines in dress blues outside of a movie, and suddenly his little power trip didn't feel so comfortable anymore. These weren't random protesters or concerned citizens. These were active-duty United States Marines, and we had a way of commanding respect without saying a word. I approached Morrison first, keeping my voice calm and professional. "Officer, I'm Sergeant Rodriguez, United States Marine Corps. I'd like to see some identification on the individual you've arrested." It wasn't a request, and Morrison was smart enough to recognize the difference. He handed me Roland's wallet with shaking hands, probably hoping I'd find some outstanding warrants or something that would justify this circus. Instead, I found Roland's retired military ID, his Bronze Star citation, and a faded photograph of him in his army dress uniform standing next to Margaret on their wedding day. She looked beautiful in that simple white dress, and he looked proud as hell to be marrying her. "Officer Morrison," I said, reading his name tag, "can you explain to me what crime Mr. Kemper has committed that required the use of a taser on a 70-year-old decorated veteran?" Morrison started stammering about trespassing and resisting arrest, but his story was falling apart faster than a house of cards in a hurricane, especially when the cemetery director showed up. Apparently, someone had called him about the disturbance and confirmed that Roland had every right to be there following his wife's funeral service. "Mr. Kemper has been a friend of this cemetery for over 40 years, the director explained to the growing crowd. "He's helped us with maintenance, donated money for improvements, and never caused a moment of trouble. His wife was buried here yesterday, and he has my personal permission to visit her grave whenever he needs to." Morrison's supervisor arrived about 10 minutes later, took one look at the situation, 7 Marines in dress blues surrounding a patrol car containing an arrested veteran, and immediately went into damage control mode. Lieutenant Peterson had been a cop for 20 years and could smell a lawsuit from 3 counties away. "What exactly happened here, Morrison?" Peterson's voice carried the kind of authority that Morrison wished he had. While Morrison stumbled through his version of events, Peterson was already calculating how many zeros this mistake was going to cost the department. The Marines formed a protective perimeter around the patrol car, while Lieutenant Peterson sorted things out. We weren't threatening anyone, but we made it clear that Roland was under our protection now. Jake Williams, who'd done 3 tours in Afghanistan, positioned himself directly between Morrison and the patrol car. Mike Santos, our unit's former boxing champion, stood at parade rest with his hands behind his back, but somehow managed to look incredibly intimidating doing it. Within 30 minutes, the handcuffs came off. Roland emerged from that patrol car looking every one of his 70 years, his dignity restored by brothers who understood what it meant to serve something bigger than yourself. I helped him straighten his tie and brush the grass stains off his suit jacket, while Jake Williams picked up his American flag pin from where it had fallen during the arrest. "Thank you, boys," Roland said, his voice stronger now, but still thick with emotion. "I never expected. I thought those days were behind me. The brotherhood, you know? Once a Marine, always a Marine, sir," I told him, "and that goes double for soldiers who've earned their stripes the hard way. We take care of our own." Roland walked back to Margaret's grave with 7 Marines flanking him like an honor guard. We stood at attention while he finished what he'd come to do, saying goodbye to the woman who'd been his anchor for 43 years. He talked to her about the morning's events, about how proud she would have been to see these young Marines stand up for what's right, about how much he missed her laugh and her terrible cooking and the way she always stole the covers. When he was finished, Roland turned to each of us individually and shook our hands. "Margaret would have liked you boys," he said. "She always said the measure of a man isn't what he accomplishes, but who he's willing to stand up for when it matters." The fallout from that morning was swift and decisive. Morrison's body camera footage, which he'd conveniently forgotten to mention, showed everything. The excessive force, the lack of proper assessment, the complete failure to show basic human decency to a grieving widower. His career in law enforcement ended before his probationary period was up. The other officers involved faced suspension and mandatory retraining on de-escalation techniques and proper treatment of elderly citizens. The department implemented new policies requiring supervisory approval for any arrest of someone over 65 for minor infractions. Lieutenant Peterson personally apologized to Roland and offered to have the entire incident expunged from any records. But the real change happened in the community. The story spread through social media like wildfire, becoming a symbol of everything wrong with authority without wisdom, and everything right with people willing to stand up for what's decent. Roland received hundreds of letters from veterans across the country, sharing their own stories of mistreatment and thanking him for bringing attention to how our elderly veterans are sometimes forgotten and disrespected. 3 weeks later, I got a call from Roland asking if the 7 of us could meet him at the cemetery again. We thought maybe there was another problem, but when we arrived in dress blues, we found something completely different. Roland was standing at Margaret's grave, with 7 handwritten letters, 1 for each of us, along with a small American flag and a bouquet of yellow roses. "These are for you boys," he said, handing out the letters. "Margaret always taught me that when someone does something important for you, you thank them properly, in writing, with your own hand." I opened my letter right there, and I'm not ashamed to say it brought tears to my eyes. Roland had written about what our presence meant to him that day. How we'd reminded him that honor still exists in the world, that there are still people willing to stand up for what's right even when it's hard. But more than that, he wrote about how Margaret would have been proud to see young servicemen and women continuing to fight for the values they'd both believed in their whole lives. "She used to worry," Roland wrote in my letter, "that the America we fought for was disappearing, that people had forgotten what it meant to serve something bigger than themselves. You boys proved her wrong that day. You reminded an old soldier that the brotherhood never dies, that honor isn't just a word on a medal, and that sometimes the most important battles are fought not on foreign soil, but right here at home, when good people stand up to protect those who can't protect themselves. The last paragraph hit me the hardest. Margaret's final gift to me wasn't her peaceful passing or even her last words of love. Her gift was showing me, through your actions, that the values we spent our lives defending are still worth fighting for. Every veteran deserves to be treated with the dignity their service has earned. Every person deserves compassion in their darkest moments, and every community needs people brave enough to stand up when those principles are threatened. That's the America worth fighting for, boys. That's the America worth coming home to. Roland visits Margaret's grave every Tuesday now, always bringing fresh flowers, and always wearing that navy blue suit with the American flag pin. The cemetery director made sure he has a key to the gates so he can come and go as he pleases. Sometimes I join him there and we'll talk about Margaret, about the Marines in our unit, about what it means to serve and to be served by others. Last month, Roland started volunteering at the VA hospital, visiting with elderly veterans who don't have family nearby. He brings them stories from the VFW, updates on local sports teams, and most importantly, the knowledge that someone gives a damn about them. He tells them about that day at the cemetery, about 7 Marines who proved that the brotherhood of service never ends. You know what I learned that day? Roland told me during our last visit to Margaret's grave. I learned that Margaret was right all along. She used to say that America isn't perfect, but it's perfectible. That every generation has to fight to make it a little better for the next one. You boys didn't just stand up for one old soldier that day. You stood up for the idea that how we treat our veterans, how we treat people in their worst moments, that's what defines us as a nation. I think about that morning at Oakwood Cemetery every time I put on my dress blues now, about how easy it would have been to ignore that phone call, to assume someone else would handle it, to mind my own business. But that's not what Marines do. That's not what Americans do when they're living up to their best selves. Roland Kemper taught me that day that being a warrior isn't just about fighting overseas. Sometimes it's about standing in a cemetery in your dress blues, making sure a grieving widower gets the respect his service has earned. Sometimes it's about reminding people in authority that power without wisdom is just bullying with a badge. And sometimes it's about understanding that the most important battles we fight aren't against foreign enemies, but against the indifference and cruelty that can creep into our own communities when good people decide to look the other way. That's a lesson worth learning, worth sharing, and worth living by. Every veteran deserves better than what happened to Roland that day. Every person deserves better. And every one of us has the power to make sure it doesn't happen again. One moment of courage at a time.